Okay, welcome everyone to our next session, which will be hosted by Metagov, and it'll be a Metagov and PolicyKit workshop. So thank you. We have Amy Zhang and Miriam Ashton who will be leading this session. So you can go ahead and introduce yourselves, Amy and Miriam, and we can go from there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Zhang. I'll be talking to you all about the PolicyKit tool and how you can use it in this hackathon. And I am an assistant professor at University of Washington in computer science. Miriam, do you want to go?
Mm-hmm. Hey, everyone. I'm Miriam. I'm a research engineer working with the Metagov project. So I'll be talking mostly about the Metagov prototype software, which I'm hoping some of you will use in the challenges. And then we'll talk about those two Metagov and PolicyKit related challenges and then take questions.
Okay, cool. And then also you can feel free to leave any questions in the chat or comments in the chat, and Miriam will be able to look at the chat.
Yep.
Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to cover a bunch of things. First, I'll introduce PolicyKit, why we built it, how it works. Miriam's going to go into Metagov, as well as how to combine PolicyKit with Metagov. And then, as she mentioned, we'll be going into the two challenges and then Q&A, but definitely feel free to ask your questions during the talk. Okay, so first off, I'm going to describe PolicyKit. And there's our fun logo, which I'm very proud of. The PolicyKit tool is a software tool to support building governance in online communities. You can learn more at our website, policykit.org. There's a little bit more about me at the bottom again. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why we built PolicyKit. We started building PolicyKit, I want to say now, winter of 2019. Yeah, it's been a while. So first, I'd like you to think about all the tools you use every day to participate in online communities. So anything from Slack, Discourse, perhaps, email, Discord, Facebook groups, Reddit, all these different kinds of tools for online communities and online discourse. And now I want you to think about how these tools are governed. What is the process by which actions that actions in the community actually get approved and happen? So if you think about it for a moment, the answer to this question is actually strikingly similar from platform to platform, right? So almost all of these platforms have some sort of governance model that involves admins or administrators, as well as sometimes mods or moderators, and then there's regular users. Right, so if you're an admin or you're a mod, you have the ability to make the rules and carry out the rules to govern others. But if you're a regular user, you can't at all. And this is baked into the software of all these tools that you use. And an admin mod model is an example of a roles and permissions model. And the way that a permissions model works is basically whenever a user wants to do something, for instance, they want to ban another user from the community. What the system does is it goes in and it checks a permissions table that's sitting in a database somewhere and sees whether that user has the permission to do that thing. And if so, then the action is approved. And then also, in order to modify governance, only certain roles can actually change a user's permissions. So here, you would have an admin role. They would have the permission to actually modify the governance itself. For instance, to give another user, take away their mod powers, or give another user mod powers. And meanwhile, once again, regular users don't have any say in the governance of their community. And this permissions model is also really prevalent in most collaborative software that you're using every day, not just online community software. So anything from Google Drive, calendaring applications, Dropbox, GitHub, Zoom, even down to the access control for files in UNIX-like operating systems, which is where we think this idea of a permissions model kind of started and has kind of percolated through all the collaborative systems we use today. But when you look around, a permissions model of governance can only describe a limited set of possible governance actions. So for the most part, it's top-down, it's autocratic, and it's typically punitive. But when we look at our offline communities and our offline governance, there are a lot of other styles of governance that exist, right? So, and many of these styles more closely embody the values of your particular community. So if a community wanted to have a different style of governance, say a more democratic style of governance, they have basically two options. So either they have to kind of carry out manually in an ad hoc way because they don't have that capability baked into the software. And this can be cumbersome to do. It can be error prone because it's being done manually. And there are a couple examples of places where this exists. For instance, some Reddit subreddits and some Discord servers actually hold elections for mods, for instance. Or they can use or build one-off software tools for doing things like taking a poll or carrying out a particular rule. So for instance, on Wikipedia, there are like a ton of these little one-off bots for carrying out certain governance procedures, like opening and closing a debate or counting up the votes from a debate. And again, these can be kind of hard to maintain because each tool only addresses one small portion of the governance, and then it can be hard to get different tools to work together. And at the end of the day, oh yes, forgot to put that. At the end of the day, because the underlying software these communities are using, it already has embedded this admin mod structure kind of really baked into the software itself. It takes effort for a community to actually work around that. So, you know, despite having on English Wikipedia, for instance, some deliberative democracy practices in their governance, the MediaWiki software that they work on top of still has baked in a roles and permissions model. So we thought, okay, well, software doesn't necessarily have to be built this way, right? And in our project, the PolicyKit project, we ask, you know, what if we didn't start from a roles and permissions-based model for governance? Instead, what if communities had a way to build for themselves the kinds of governance structures that they want and that actually suits their own community's needs and values? And so that's what PolicyKit is. It's basically a software infrastructure that empowers the members of an online community to be able to concisely author a wide range of governance procedures and then actually be able to automatically carry out those procedures on their home platforms. So it forms the software infrastructure upon which governance rests. And PolicyKit's main insight in terms of technical construction of governance is to shift governance from articulating this kind of roles and permissions model to articulating procedures, where a procedure can express a much wider range of governance models, including participatory procedures and democratic procedures. So now instead of that looking up a table in the database for whether you have a particular permission or not, this is what happens in PolicyKit. We run policies, what we call policies, which are these short procedural scripts that govern whether an action can take place or not. So once again, user A would like to do action X. For instance, they would like to ban a member from the community. First, we check the policies that govern X, and that checking process is kind of happening in a loop. And there's a script that's written that says, you know, before X can happen, first it must be approved by a majority of community members. And once that actually happens, and this script is kind of checking to see if it happens or not, then finally the action can be approved. And scripts are something that people can write. In addition to being able to write the script from nothing, you can also modify scripts. So you can propose an action in order to change an existing script/policy. And this is how people can modify governance over time. And of course, we have policies for governing those actions in terms of actually updating a policy. So for example, user A would like to change the policy governing X. They would like to update a policy. So we can now check the policies that govern changing existing policies. It's a little bit of a meta thing. But as an example, to change any policy, a 2/3 majority vote must first approve the change. And this would be written up in code. So once that happens, then the policy can actually be changed. So what we have here is we kind of have two tiers of policies. We call these platform policies and constitution policies, taking inspiration from Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, where we have policies that govern everyday actions that a community might be doing, such as accepting comments, moderating comments, electing people to specific roles, or deciding whether any of these kind of everyday actions could occur. And then we have policies that govern constitutions of the constitution of the community. So this is, things that modify the governance itself. So whether or not a policy can actually be changed. So I can give some examples of that. So as I mentioned before, we have these actions, these one-off events users can propose. We have this long-running series of scripts that are constantly checking to see whether these actions can actually happen or not. And of course, since it's a process, so sometimes there's a time before we actually know whether an action can actually happen. There is polling that can happen, and it could take days or weeks for something to be decided. And in the meantime, we're kind of constantly checking to see whether the conditions have been met. So here's an example. An example of an action would be Sarah would like to post the message "Hi" to the announcements channel on Slack, which is one of the platforms we can work with. In the meantime, there's a policy that says any posts to the announcements channel must first be approved by a moderator. So here's now an example of a constitution policy. So Jane would like to introduce a new policy for renaming channels. So this is the action of proposing a new policy to begin with. And there may be an existing policy called that is a constitution policy, and it would say to add any new policy, it first must be voted in by majority vote. And so these are the components of PolicyKit that make it work. So we really wanted PolicyKit to be able to work with online communities where they are and where they exist, as opposed to forcing communities to go to a new platform for having discussion or for doing things where we would then have to build all of it. So what we do is we actually integrate with different platforms using their API. So far, we've integrated with platforms like Slack, Reddit, Discord, and Discourse, where you can simply log into your Discord, for instance, on the PolicyKit website, and then connect your community to PolicyKit. And then at that point, PolicyKit will be governing the actions that happen on your Discord server. We also have an important platform integration with Metagov that allows us to connect with a whole host of additional tools, which Miriam will be talking about. So the integrations part is one important aspect of PolicyKit. In addition, we have a policy engine, and this is kind of that long-running service that I mentioned that's constantly checking, running policies, checking to see whether actions that are coming in can happen. And if you see in my diagram down there, it's that kind of orange loop that's happening. Actions are coming in via the platform in that blue arrow going to the right. We also have a PolicyKit website where on the website we have an editing environment for you to author policies. And these are short scripts written in Python. We have documentation, etc., to make it easier to write policies. And then once policies are written, then they join the policy engine and are kind of continually checked. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of a policy, because one of the challenges that we have for you all is to author some of these policies to come up with your own governance structure. So here's an example of a policy that creates a random jury of members to vote on renaming Slack channels. And writing a policy currently involves implementing 6 small functions in Python. Okay, so the first function that you have to implement is called filter. And in this function, the policy selects what action it governs. In this case, we only want to govern actions for renaming Slack channels in this policy. So this is very simple, 2 lines. If action.action codename equals Slack rename channel, which is the name of the action, and in our documentation, we have a list of all the actions and their names, then return true. So this is just a filter step. Then in the initialize function, we set up anything we need to get the policy going. So for probably a lot of your policies, this is just going to be empty, or you would put pass. In this case, we actually need to set up who the members of the random jury are. So this is just a little bit of code that grabs all the users in the community, which you would have access to that data, then randomly selects 3 of them, and then stores that information into a little data store. So you have like a little bit of memory there. Then the third function is the notify function. And here you have to implement anything that you want to notify users in the community about. So in this case, we want to notify just those 3 jury members that they've been selected to be in this jury and they have to vote, and any other instructions like please deliberate among yourselves, or this vote will close in a day, and if you don't vote, then we will select a new jury, for instance. So here we have some code that grabs those jury members, which we had stored in our data store. And then we just call this notify action function, which we've written, and there's an API to kind of support you with writing code for the policies. And it just takes care of actually sending out those messages on Slack, so that people who are participating in this don't have to ever leave their Slack interface. Okay, next we have the check function. And this is kind of like the core part of the policy. Check is basically the function, the code that you write to explain or describe what are the conditions for an action to actually be able to pass. So in the jury case, we specify, and you could have any kind of rule that you want because you can write your own policies. But in this case, we specify that if 2 or more jury members have voted yes, then it passes. We set a time limit of 2 days for the voting period. Otherwise, if we don't do that, actions can kind of be in this limbo state indefinitely if jury members don't vote. So we set a time elapsed, and if it doesn't, if votes are not collected by that time, then the action fails. And then finally, we have a pass function and a fail function. So what happens when the action passes, and what happens when the action fails? When the action fails, nothing happens. So we just write return or pass there. And then in the pass function, we say action.execute, which is, again, a helper function that we've written that you can just call, and then the system takes care of actually renaming the channel on Slack. Okay, so that was kind of like a overview of how you actually can write a policy. I've already mentioned that PolicyKit, in addition to having the ability to author policies in kind of this very flexible way, you can pretty much do almost anything since you have the ability to write code. I also mentioned that PolicyKit automatically carries out these procedures on their home platform, right? So I'm going to explain a little bit how that actually happens. Okay, and it involves a bunch of steps. So first, say a user, and again, let's talk again about this like hypothetical case about someone who wants to rename a channel on Slack and is going through PolicyKit to determine whether that can happen. And again, we really wanted to do this so that people didn't have to go to a PolicyKit website or leave Slack for all this to happen, because that could be really cumbersome. So okay, first, say a user wants to rename a channel in Slack, so they go to the Slack interface and they rename the channel. What we have in PolicyKit then is, as part of our platform integration, we have a listener that is constantly listening and catching actions that are happening on the platform that need to be governed. So our Slack listener catches that action, and then it sends it over to our policy engine, which is our kind of long-running process for checking all actions that come through. At this point, we cycle through the policies that exist for this community. we find, for instance, the jury policy for renaming channels, and we run the filter function, and we see that it passes the filter. So this policy is governing this action. At this point, we run the initialize code. We're kind of going through the policy. We run the check code to see, can this policy or can this action pass given this policy yet? Turns out it can't, because we have a jury, right? And the jury hasn't voted yet. I mean, they don't even know yet that they're in the jury. So what we have to do at this point is we actually have to go and quickly revert the action on Slack. So it's as if the person hadn't done it on Slack, because we don't know yet actually whether or not that person can actually do that action. So, and again, it's PolicyKit that takes care of this for you. You don't have to write code for this part. You just have to write those 6 functions. But we go and we revert the action on Slack. Then we continue cycling through our policy. At this point, we want to notify jury members that they're in a jury and they can vote. They actually can vote within Slack, so they can use the emoji up and down emoji reactions to vote specifically on the message that we notified them with. And then in our platform integrator, we have a listener that's catching those votes as they happen and updating our vote count in the PolicyKit side, so that as we're looping and checking continually whether this policy can pass, at some point that vote count updates and we can say, oh, looks like it should pass now. And then we go in and rename the channel. So those are all the steps that are kind of happening. And as you can see, there's a lot of them, but what you really have to worry about as a policy author is just those 6 functions that I talked about in the policy. So a little bit more about what you can do as a policy author. There's JSON blob data, where this was like kind of the memory store that I was talking about. You can kind of push things to this JSON blob and get things from the JSON blob. We also have a way within PolicyKit to also create roles and permissions to override policies if you want to. Again, you don't have to use roles and permissions in our system. We also have a feature within PolicyKit for authoring text documents and for governing text documents in the case where you have natural language policies like community guidelines. Here's just kind of what the PolicyKit website looks like. There's kind of a home page where you can see users, roles, you can see the code behind all the policies, all the documents. You can see what actions have happened recently. This is just like a test example. And then on the right, this is showing what the editing interface looks like to write a policy. And that's basically it for me. We have a dedicated PolicyKit server that we've set up for this hackathon. That's the URL. If you're interested in the code behind PolicyKit, it's all open source on GitHub. The documentation for PolicyKit is probably going to be very useful, and we also have example policies at that URL. PolicyKit.org is like the official webpage of PolicyKit, which doesn't have too much information right now, but you can read our paper on PolicyKit. Soon, we do plan to release a hosted version of PolicyKit, but it's not ready yet. Please reach out if you're interested in participating in any design workshops. We're planning to have a couple this summer as we're still developing PolicyKit. Okay, and then I'll hand it over now to Miriam.
Thanks, Amy. Cool. So, and one caveat with that dedicated hackathon server that's in the chat, stability there is not guaranteed. So like, yeah, use with caution, and I'll be around in the Telegram chat if there's any issues. But definitely like back up your policies if you're writing policies in that hosted version. Did I see a hand raised? Is there someone trying to ask a question? Or should we take questions now?
Yeah, no, I think that was just someone trying to clap hands. If anyone has a question, please note them in the chat.
Cool. Awesome. So I think, Amy, you're going to click through the slides for me, but I'll just introduce myself again. I'm the research engineer working on Metagov. And the word Metagov is used a lot in the hackathon docs, but right now I'm using it to refer to the specific Metagov prototype, which is a early prototype of a API gateway for digital governance tools. So the hackathon will be the first time that anyone outside the Metagov community is using it. So we're really excited to get some people developing on it and using it and getting feedback. So in the next slide, I'll talk about what I mean by governance tools. So thinking really broadly about what governance is, beyond just like whether someone is allowed to take a certain action, like the whole collective decision making or any kind of decision making or workflows that happen to manage a community. So there's a lot of really cool tools out there for governing communities. Lumio, for example, is a voting and discussion platform. Open Collective is for managing community finances in a transparent way. Of course, Sputnik DAO is for or supports like voting on proposals. That circle is SourceCred, which is a tool for communities to measure and reward value creation. I think there may be a SourceCred specific workshop. I'm not sure if that's happening during this hackathon. And then Discourse, which of course is a social platform, I would argue is also a governance tool. It has lots of great features for voting and assigning the trust levels to individuals and more. So these are all the kinds of governance tools that Metagov aims to expose using like a common API. So as Amy said, like communities exist on multiple platforms, right? But they also potentially want to use multiple different governance tools to govern their community as a whole. And an issue or the sort of experiment of Metagov is trying to tackle this issue that these governance tools don't really talk to each other. I would say with the exception maybe of SourceCred, which integrates with Discourse, Discord, and GitHub already so that a community that exists on those platforms can use SourceCred across them to track their value creation across each of those. But aside from that, there's not really ways to connect like the voting tools of Lumio with the finance management of Open Collective, for example. Can you go to the next slide? So here's a really sort of simplified diagram of how Metagov works together with PolicyKit and connects to these other services. So Metagov sort of sits between these external tools and PolicyKit to provide a common interface. And you can see it's called the driver there. PolicyKit is just one example of a governance driver and sort of the first tool that we're using Metagov with. But PolicyKit can be used without Metagov, and Metagov can be used without PolicyKit. So those are two independent, both Django services, two independent tools, but they are integrated. They can be used together. And Metagov has a plugin architecture. So each of these gray boxes here is like a plugin that's connecting to another service. And ideally, the goal is to sort of have an ecosystem and community around governance plugins. Right now, we have about like 5 or 6 of them that I've written, and the plugins provide implement a standard of governance. I'll talk about on the next slide. Yes. Oh, can you click again? That's weird. Yes. Okay. Cool. So yeah, Metagov and PolicyKit communicate via API requests over the local network. Just want to call that out as an important thing that it's happening over the local network. There's no authentication between these two services. It's really, Metagov is really meant to be deployed alongside an existing script or service and communicating locally. On the next slide, if you go, I'll explain the different types of governance endpoints. So each of those plugins can implement any of these 3 interfaces. So action endpoints for performing actions on an external service, such as sending a user a message or suspending a user. Asynchronous governance process endpoints, which is broadly defined as any asynchronous operation. The standard example that we have is voting. So asynchronous in that you kick off a vote, there's input over some period of time, and then once some condition is met, the process ends. And then thirdly, emitting webhook events from the external platforms. So Metagov plugins can listen to events happening on external platforms or poll external platforms for events, and then push those to Metagov, push those to PolicyKit. So like Amy was showing with the examples of policies that govern actions where, say, like someone renames a Slack channel or some event happens and it kicks off a policy evaluation, that's sort of the purpose of these webhook events. And those are happening through webhook API requests. So we'll go through some examples of the plugins that exist right now, Near being probably the most interesting one to this group. So the three columns here are those three I just mentioned. So actions, async processes, and events. So right now the Near plugin has a really basic call action or call and view. This is just one example of each for making contract calls to Near contracts. And there's a challenge area for emitting events from the Near plugin for like events that are happening on the contract, which I'll talk about later. So some other examples are of actions are creating a discussion on Lumio, process and expense on Open Collective. So for example, in the example policies, we have one where a user submits an expense to get paid in Open Collective, and then the policy triggers some vote on another platform, and then it goes back and accepts or rejects it based on the outcome. So that action supports that kind of policy. Source cred, there's just an action for getting a user's cred. And then if we look at the async processes, these are all votes or polls, which are just synonymous as far as I know. And Lumio, of course, is a voting platform. On Open Collective, we have implemented like a emoji voting, just like what Amy talked about with Slack, using the Open Collective conversation tool. And on Discourse, it has a native polling feature. We have lots of other ideas for different plugins for Telegram and GitHub and different tools, but these also have a long way to be expanded to include different kinds of actions and processes too. So if we let's go to the next slide. Yeah, more in depth on the Near example. So this is from the Open API docs. Let me just throw a link in the chat. Should have prepared that. This shows the Near call action. And so it really is like very broad, and the plugin author just defines like what the inputs and output types are, and then there's this documentation generated. But this uses the Near Python API to just make a call, and it's very basic. Uses like I think it requires you to use the master account or something. And if you go to the next slide, it shows how to use that API endpoint in PolicyKit. So if you're in PolicyKit, have it installed to a community, and you activate the Near plugin for your community by inputting like your Near community contract, then you can make a request to perform a Near call from a PolicyKit policy. So this shows what that looks like, and I just hard-coded here. It's making a Near call payout proposal to pay me on testnet. So this like Metagov perform action is documented in the PolicyKit documentation for how to use that Metagov client. But probably like the example policy library is the best way to go to like figure out how to write these policies. Next slide. Okay, so yeah, that was the synchronous actions, and now onto the asynchronous processes, just showing sort of how that works. On the left, you have, again, this is from the OpenAPI docs, the discourse poll. It uses a pretty standard way that async REST APIs work, which is you make a post request to start the vote, and then you pass a callback URL, and Metagov will post back to that callback whenever the state changes for the vote. So if it subscribes to those. So if a vote changes, or if a vote is cast, or when the vote is completed, it'll hit that callback URL with the latest status. And then it also returns a 201 response with the location header for getting the latest update. And again, this right now, like each plugin author, like the plugin author for the discourse plugin doesn't have to worry about like this API interface. They implement like a pretty simple Python class for the vote, and then the Metagov core will expose it as an API with this form. So on the right, it shows like what the poll looks like in discourse. So this is another tool. In this example, like Metagov created this poll to vote on something, or PolicyKit created this poll to vote on some action that's occurring. Thanks, Chloe. Great. Okay, next slide. Right. All right. I think that's all for just the Metagov intro, and we can talk about the 2 challenge areas. So the first one is experimenting with PolicyKit and the Metagov prototype. This language is copied from the website. I think there's a couple more sentences there, but the challenge area is basically just propose PolicyKit policies that address like actual real governance problems for communities that use multiple platforms and or multiple governance tools. And Amy, jump in with like sort of what you're looking for with this challenge. But in my mind, like this doesn't have to be technical. Like most likely, if it's a real world problem, it probably can't be solved with exactly the actions and tools that we necessarily expose right now, and that's okay. It's more getting people thinking in the mindset of the PolicyKit policy model, and learning from you all about what governance problems exist, sort of where are the gaps between the tools that you do use. So one example, like we've heard when speaking with, I think it was James, was about the way that proposals happen in NEAR, right, where they're discussed in the discourse forum, but they're voted on in the Sputnik DAO interface. And I think that's a common thing of separating. Yeah, I mean, there's like infinite ways that the different tools could be combined, but we're interested in like not just like fictitious policies that combine as many tools as you can, but not that. Instead, we want to see like more realistic policy ideas. Amy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, and you know, I think you don't necessarily have to be a programmer in order to propose a policy. Like the examples that Miriam and I have showed so far are all written up in code, but you're welcome to write something that's not written up in code. It's in this sort of similar structure, and then maybe we could even work with you to like think about how one might write that up in code so that you could actually test it out on our PolicyKit server. Alternatively, if you are a programmer, then you could perhaps use the interface, the editors, the documentation that we've provided to actually like stress test our tools, see if you find any bugs as you try to implement a policy. Should we move on to the next challenge?
Are there any questions about this one before we go to the next one? We can move on and see if people can think of questions before the end.
Okay.
So this challenge is a little bit more, is more technical. It's to actually develop either on the existing Near plugin or creating a new Near or Sputnik DAO specific plugin. So the actual challenge text is look at the website for that, and it has like the appropriate links. But one of the main ideas is this emitting webhooks for Near contract events. So the idea being implementing that sort of listener functionality for the Near plugin so that you could write a policy, for example, that says when a proposal is passed in my Sputnik DAO contract, then award this person a badge in discourse or something like that. That in order to do that, you need to get that event notification triggered that thing actually happened on chain. And I included a link on the challenge to some like Near indexer that I think could be used for this. But I'm not like a Near or blockchain person. So that's also sort of like why this challenge is out here. And the next thing is about like security and accounts, which probably Near folks that look at the plugin will be horrified at. Like it asks you to like upload the secret key for the master account or something like that. It's really just like a proof of concept to be like, look, we can make Near API calls using the RPC API that it exposes. But it would be really awesome to see like any submissions that are creating a new Near plugin that actually is like useful and like makes sense for Near folks, whether that's like supporting like multiple different DAOs for a community, or changing the way that the accounts work so that it makes more sense, or implementing anything else that is useful. That's pretty much all I have to say about that one. And the website links to the actual code where the existing plugin is. And here are a bunch more links that I can drop in the chat while people think of questions, maybe.
Yeah, let me know once you've pasted those in so that I can leave the full screen. We don't have any other slides.
Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And I know Vandal just said he's dropping off, but Vandal is the head of the Near Music Guild as well. And I think a question I might have, maybe from Vandal or from people that are running these councils and are running Sputnik DAOs, because we do use discourse for Near governance, and the Sputnik DAOs do have a function in them on the UI where, for each proposal you submit a discourse link to, as proof of or as showing what this proposal is about. And so as people during this hackathon, this 3-week event, are thinking of proposals for that conceptual idea, I'm assuming that if people just came to you with ideas, you can work with them through, like, for the Near Music Guild, they're trying to make like a marketing guild, for example, a guild that would help you with, mixing or doing live shows. Some of that might also take, doing legal contracts or, bringing other, ideas on chain. So you guys are going to have sessions for that as well, so they can you guys will help them through their ideas. Is that?
So I think we have office hours. Correct me if I'm wrong, Miriam. And I think we're available basically in the next several weeks if you want to ping us. I think Miriam's on Telegram and also the Near Discord, and we can set up a channel for us to talk more if folks need help.
Okay, because I think that it would be really helpful for even the council members that are leading some of these DAOs to understand how they can interact with each other moving forward, using the discourse forum specifically. So I think that would be really great to get going moving forward. If no one else has any questions, we can end the session here. If that's all right, we can go back to the tables. And if people want to discuss, that is fine. Or you can use the networking sessions as you'd like for the rest of the hackathon. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out for today's events. Next up, we have the Near Music Guild with NXM Live #2. And so go out on Twitch for that. And I'll drop the link for that in a second. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to today's events, and we'll see you tomorrow as well. So thank you as well, Miriam and Amy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye.